Adrian will speak first, isn't it?
Yes, Adrian will speak first, and we're just about to go live, and I'm starting the session.
From the general to the particular.
That's it. Exactly right. Hello, comrades. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're going to do a special educational session in the LLA education series. We've been looking previously at the current war between Russia and Ukraine, and we have talked about it at length, that this is clearly not just a war between Russia and Ukraine. We have on the one side NATO, the USA, UK, etc., lining up behind Ukraine and supporting it financially to the tune of many millions of pounds and dollars. China is not directly and not crudely on the side of Russia, but many believe that the US is pumping that much money into this war, less of reasons of helping Ukraine and more to do with creating a deterrent to try and stop the rise of China as a serious rival to US hegemony. So we want to look at some issues around those issues. Perhaps in the discussion, we can also get to the idea of what socialists should do. Should we support either side? Should we take the side of China? Is it perhaps even a deformed worker state, as some people on the left still believe? I don't, but I know that lots of people do. So we're open for all kinds of discussions and questions from the floor. We're aiming to finish at about 7:30, but we can go a little over if necessary. We have two experts on these issues, and we're very pleased to welcome, first of all, Adrian Budd. He is the UCU branch secretary and has written numerous articles on China and currently completing a book on contemporary China. He will look completed.
Completed.
Oh, well, excellent. Very glad. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can we buy it already?
No. It's with the editorial people, you know.
We're looking forward to it. So we're starting with Adrian, and then we're taking a look at the Chinese economy and the question of Taiwan with Comrade Ao. So first over to Adrian. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Tina. Let me just share my talk as a PowerPoint.
There it is, yeah.
Which I will do as a, what's the name, show. What happened there? Sorry. Sorry, the technology's slideshow.
Yeah, if you press from beginning, top left.
Yeah. So it suddenly got smaller then. Right, come on. From the beginning. There we are. Phew.
It's slowly doing it, I think.
It may just be that I have to, okay, right, I have to touch this. Okay, there's the title. I gave it a title, but it's really US-China rivalry today. I've put the asymmetric imperialisms to indicate that I think China is an imperialist, but most for tonight's meeting, as Tina's indicated, the Ukraine war is being used by America to really tighten the noose technologically and militarily around China, which I'll go through. The asymmetry, to me, what America's up to is making sure that China remains very firmly number two, and if possible, number 3 or 4 or 5, if they can get away with what has been referred to as decoupling. It's my view, and Tina's alluded to this, that Biden really wants the war to be quite a long-lasting war, not least because it enables the United States to corral the rest of the West behind it, to restore its leadership of the West, its hegemony, to tie Russia down and denude its military capabilities. But I think there's also for Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership, there's also an interest in it being a long war, which I think is why they haven't really given very much military aid to Russia, even if they wanted to, and I'm not at all convinced that there's much of an alliance there. My instinct is that what I've read recently is they're sending the sort of military equipment that's not non-lethal, like helmets and this sort of thing, but very little of anything else. But one crucial thing I know Al's going to speak about is the Taiwan situation. I'm not going to mention it very much, except to say that the Biden administration is using a parallel, Russia in Ukraine, apparently as a prelude to China in Taiwan. I think this is far-fetched. I know Xi has said to the military, prepare for unification with Taiwan by 2027. I think that's for internal domestic purposes, for, you know, nationalism and so on and so forth, to maintain the hegemony of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't see very much in the way of military intervention by China in Taiwan. And my understanding, or the way I understand it, is that there's only one pretext for China move on Taiwan, and that is if there's a declaration of independence. And the American leadership know very well there's only one circumstance in which Taiwan would declare independence, which is if they had already cleared it with the United States. And consequently, I don't see, I may be being optimistic about this, but I don't see military intervention by China. Anyway, that's the background, the Ukraine connection. Let's just go through how the United States, the Americans, are putting pressure on China, and the response from the weaker side, the Chinese side. Obama and Hillary Clinton pivoted, famous phrase, pivoted to Asia in 2011. As the Financial Times put it, it doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to recognize that Clinton and Obama are trying to bandwagon or railroad the rest of Asia against China and behind America. Quite clear-sighted, I thought, from the Financial Times. Trump intensified it. Biden's intensified it further. That's a quote from just after a piece of legislation was passed by the American governmental machinery called the Innovation and Competition Act. We are in a competition to win the 21st century, and the starting gun has gone off. That's what we're up to. I mean, it's pretty clear. And they've launched their own kind of version of the Belt and Road Initiative called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. On the Xi Jinping China side, clearly there are moves, and have been for a decade or so, and I'll go through this in greater detail, towards military modernization, the militarization of the South China Sea, the Belt and Road Initiative itself to extend China's influence in the world. And this poses the question, is China expansionist, which I will hopefully address later in the meeting. So there's the sort of general background. More precisely, it's America that is the most expansionist. That is a map, not a very clear one, of NATO's global partners. NATO, as you can see in the top left, is obviously North America and Western Europe, but the lighter blue are global partners. If we'd gone back a few years, that would look slightly different, and its global partners would have included Russia and Kazakhstan and so on, but clearly, at the moment, at least, Russia's out of the equation as a partner of NATO, but under Partnership for Peace could be construed as a global partner. And as you can see in grey, China's really pretty much encircled by NATO. Now that's bad enough in the sense of the asymmetry between the two. If we then add in something that's happened in the last 2 years, or a couple of things that have happened in the last few years, and that is the Quad and AUKUS. Now the Quad in yellow, in green, is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is United States, India, Japan, and Australia, which was formed in 2007, didn't do very much, and was revitalized under Trump in 2017. And there's now talk of Quad Plus, which would include South Korea and others, Israel, Germany, and one or two others. So that's another example of a sort of tightening the belt around China. So that's an ongoing development. There's AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States alliance, which includes support for Australia's nuclear submarine program. So all in all, there's quite a significant increase in the military pressure on China. Comrades might say, well, there's a riposte from China, and it has been going for 20 years or so, called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's a picture of its membership, which looks pretty large. And I suppose in geographical territorial terms, it is pretty large, but there's no way that that is an equivalent to NATO. There is no equivalent to the Article 5. There's no mutual defense article. They don't have to come to each other's assistance. And indeed, some of the countries have recently had squabbles, skirmishes. India is now a fully paid up member. It was a dialogue partner for a long time, along with Pakistan. And India is gravitating quite rapidly towards the West. New Deal. Modi was recently in Washington. We saw Blinken having a very frosty relationship in Beijing with Xi, and on virtually at an identical time, a day or so later, I think it was, Modi signing up for new technology and defense agreements with Biden in Washington. It seems to me it's what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization represents is a marriage of convenience around political instability, shared interests in stability, particularly Islamic politics instability, by which I mean radical Islam. And most of the joint exercises in the stands in the what was Soviet Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on, are directed at internal security operations against so-called terrorists. So I think it would be wrong to say that NATO is balanced in some way by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Very far from it. If we look at what the NATO countries, in particular the United States, have been up to, this is a picture from the mid-2010s, about 2013, under Obama. That is the 7th Fleet based in Japan, the American 7th Fleet. It's joint naval operations in the seas around China in 1 year. And there were, I did count once, I think it's 100. Oh, it's in the picture there. Under Trump, the number increased. I don't have the latest figures, but it's clear that America's gearing up for something. I don't mean fully fledged war or anything like that, but certainly a containment strategy in relation to China. And the focus, you can't quite see it there, but the next slide will show it. The focus is on the East China Sea towards Taiwan and Japan, and the South China Sea past Vietnam towards Malaysia and where have you down there. And this is likely to be, in my view, the most significant flashpoint, there we are, in years to come. And the reason is, and this is where we talk about asymmetrical imperialism, China has used its power enhancement, its growth, its economic might, and its military modernization to become much more assertive amongst its neighbors. It had a foreign policy strategy, really going back to Deng Xiaoping, post-Mao. Deng Xiaoping had this phrase, bide your time and hide your capabilities. Don't rock the boat, don't bully anybody, don't look too aggressive. He didn't say don't have any capabilities, and he didn't say bide your time forever, but that bide your time became, in foreign policy strategy terms, the concept of good neighbor foreign policy. By 2010, after 20 or 30 years of this, the Chinese foreign minister was saying to you lot in the South China Sea, some countries are big, some countries are small, it's a fact, get used to it. So that was a much more assertive way of speaking to the neighbours, and there have been small skirmishes. The interesting thing there on the picture is the militarization of the South China Sea. The orange dots, the yellow squares, all that sort of thing. These are new installations on rocky outlets, outcrops, shoals and reefs, some of which are the low water level at high tide, and they built them up into air runways and naval bases and all that sort of thing in an enormous area of the South China Sea. The deep orange U shape is the territorial claim of China in those waters. When the revolution took place in 1949, in the foreign ministry, they found this map that had been drawn up by the nationalists of the Kuomintang. They took it over lock, stock and barrel. It was then it was called the 9-dash line. It's been joined up now, but it was 9 dashes. Or was it the 11-dash line? I beg your pardon. They then did an agreement with Vietnam in the 1970s, just before the end of the Vietnam-America War, in which they ceded a bit of territory, so it became the 9-dash line instead of 11. But essentially, it is a claim for the vast majority of the waters of the South China Sea. And that is causing tensions. And that is where America is directing its, what do they call it, right of navigation right, joint maneuvers and so on. I won't say much more about Taiwan. I will just say one thing, that the importance to America of Taiwan is captured partly on the map. It's right next to China, but also in the Cold War. The entirety of Africa received $7 billion of aid from America in the Cold War. Today's population, about 1.5 billion Africans, 7 billion. Taiwan, current population 25 million. I can't work out what proportion that is, 1/30th or something, received 6 billion, 1 billion less than the entirety of Africa. An absolutely clear indication of Nixon's claim that aid is given in the interest of the donor, not of the recipient. Africans might need it more, we're not interested. We're interested in Taiwan. Under Trump, military aid to Taiwan was 18 billion, and so far Biden has given 3 billion. So the numbers are staggering. And the relationship with Taiwan is deepening. So, for instance, the Taiwanese high representative in America was invited to Biden's inauguration. That's the first time that has ever happened since America shifted its diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic in 1979. So something significant seems to me to be happening in the South China Sea. On the wider question of Chinese expansionism and military modernization, well, it's definitely happening. But the imbalance is staggering. Given the narrative of China being a threat to the West, there are the figures. If we take out America, and just to simplify, the West in total, of which America is about 3/4, spends what, 4 or 5 times as much on arms as China does. If we look at one particular aspect of that, which is aircraft carriers, and it sounds a bit like toys for the boys and, you know, King's College at London University measuring how many weapons people have got and all this sort of stuff. But the aircraft carriers are really quite important because they enable power projection. You can live, as we know in the Iraq War, it's much easier to bomb Iraq or Afghanistan from a aircraft carrier than it is from the United States or NATO bases in Europe. So aircraft carriers enable you to be permanently closer to your enemy. And how many aircraft carriers are there? China, the expansionist China, has got, figures vary whether they're actually ever going to produce the number 2 there in the middle column. They've got 2 definitely. There's 2 more going through commissioning tests. There's 2 more possibly planned. It makes 6. The United States and its allies have got 71 in the same sort of state, either on the seas already or being built and so on and so forth. Complete imbalance. And here's a question: how many overseas bases has expansionist China got versus the United States? I don't know if anybody can speak while I'm speaking, so I'll have to give you the answer, I'm afraid. That sort of repartee and interaction goes out the window on Teams, possibly. China's got 1, definitely, and a few bits and pieces, like a spy base, an espionage base in Cuba. In other words, no military, no troops, just people with microphones and headsets and all this sort of thing. China's got 1, Djibouti off the Horn of Africa. United States, 800. But the narrative is China's expansionism. Okay. The United States is dedicated now to stop, as far as it can, military modernization. And that leads us to this idea of a tech war and the decoupling of the economies at a very high level. In other words, Bosch and, I don't know, toy makers and watchmakers will continue to work in China, but really high-tech semiconductor makers are under enormous pressure to pull out, to reorientate their supply chains away from China in order to deprive China of the sort of high-tech microprocessors that are central to war making, to knock out the enemy's satellites, or to target your missiles and all these sorts of things. So we've seen since 2018-19 this attempt to decouple. Starts under Trump with the attack on Huawei. Just as an aside, at the time when the pressure on Huawei was at its most intense, when the Johnson government here resisted for 6 months before it pulled out of allowing Huawei into the new 5G network in Britain. And one of the arguments from the Americans was that the servers of Huawei can feed data back into the Chinese Communist Party's HQ or the national security state in China. Even the Economist said there's no evidence that it's done this. And I was at an event, a charity bash, and I got put on a table with an IBM installer engineer. And I thought, well, this is a chance to find out. I said, you know what's going on with Huawei? Is there any truth in the claim from the West that Huawei can send data to China? And his answer was, of course they can. We do, in relation to the West. We know that they can because IBM feed into the State Department and the Pentagon. So it's clear that they are, he didn't realize why I was asking, by the way. I was very dishonest about it. And I don't even know his name, but there we are. Huawei, the Innovation and Competition Act, to give financial support to reboot American high technology industries and sectors and so on. The CHIPS Act, this is the sort of Reader's Digest approach to naming pieces of legislation. It's called Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors and Science Act 2022. In 2023, earlier this year, the US put pressure on Japan and the Netherlands. You wonder why the Netherlands, I'll tell you in a minute, to stop the sale of high-tech equipment, microprocessor and manufacturing equipment to China. The reason for the Netherlands is it's one of its firms, I think it's called ASML or ADSL or something like that, is an etching using extreme ultraviolet. It can cut the circuits on pieces of silicon to make silicon chips and so on. It's got a world monopoly on the really high-tech end of this. There are other firms that, the microprocessors in a phone are less complicated than those producing artificial intelligence or 3D imaging and all this sort of stuff, medical and military things. But the Dutch company is very important. The Japanese have just announced restrictions in 23 product areas as far as exports are concerned, and everybody knows who the target is. They name 160 countries who can't get this stuff now, but there's only really one that's important, and that's China. Overall, Biden has moved from a straightforward neoliberal model that's lasted for 30 or 40 years to a high-tech industrial policy with lots of state support for high-tech. The biggest manufacturer of microprocessors in the world, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, produces about 90% of the world's high-end. It's now moving some of its production to production sites in America. Those two plants are costing $40 billion, of which the American state is providing $15 billion, getting on for half the expenditure provided by the state, alongside lots of other export restrictions. There's also encouragement from Japan, Taiwan, and the United States for its firms to go elsewhere outside China. And we see, for instance, in Vietnam, where that photo is, of Foxconn that makes Apple products for Apple in China. It's a Taiwanese company. The picture on the top right is an advert, jobs available, apply here, sort of thing, in Vietnam. I'm not making a big claim about this. They've already started some production in India and it's not going well. I'm not predicting a very massive decoupling of the economies. And there is resistance from big capital who've sunk enormous amounts of fixed capital into China, and they can't dissect their supply chains very easily. Tesla's just opened a big new plant over there. 53% of Tesla production is just outside Shanghai. Overall, though, there is definitely a case to be made, and it has been made, that there is a new Cold War. Now, comrades may have read Gilbert Achcar's, the Lebanese socialist, book on the new Cold War. I think the jury's out on Gilbert's position. Mainly it's a book about Russia, by the way, but he's added an extra bit. He wrote much of it at the end of the 1990s, arguing that Kosovo, for instance, represented a turn in American policy back towards antagonism towards Russia. And he's reproduced the essays and added extra work on China. Mainly it's still about Russia, but I think he's got a point at one level. There's a whiff of Cold War about all this. However, I think there's a danger. Firstly, I think the substance is lacking. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union could rely on a big left in the world, which comrades will be aware of course. Maybe they were in communist parties, or certainly knew of communist parties. Some of them very large, in Latin Europe, for instance, and parts of the global south, that carried the support for the Soviet Union. China has nothing like that. There are no proxy wars currently, and probably for the very foreseeable future. I can't see China's alliance structures allowing it to sponsor proxy wars. It hasn't got an alliance structure to speak of, as I indicated. And most importantly, the interpenetration of the economies is very different to what it was in the sort of hermetically sealed Soviet bloc, relatively. I mean, we could buy Polish pigskin shoes and Hungarian wine and Bulgarian wine, but there wasn't a vast exchange either at the level of trade and certainly at the level of production, which of course is what we see in the case of China now as a zone of Western transnational production. What I think the danger is that the the label New Cold War plays into the hands of the American geostrategists. It's they who benefit from the language of Cold War because it gives them a vehicle, an excuse, a rationale for applying pressure on the rest of the West to line up behind it against China. Okay, Tina, how long have I been speaking? Do beg your pardon.
For about 30 minutes.
Oh my word. Okay.
Come to an
I will end by saying, therefore, I'm ending. I've got a little bit more about Africa and the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think as far as America and China, Western China is concerned, the point's been made long enough. And if anybody wants to ask about Africa and such like afterwards, I'm quite happy to answer questions. How's that?
Excellent. Thank you very much, comrade. If you, that's it, you stopped sharing your screen. Very interesting introduction, I think, to our subject, relating it to the question of the war drive against the war drive of the US against Russia. I think you've made some very interesting points that I'm sure we're going to come back to on the question of Cold War, for example, on the question of, has China even the capability of taking on the US, which I think we want to discuss a little bit later. We're now hearing from Comrade Au, who is a labor campaigner and writer who was based in Hong Kong for a long time. He's written a book called, well, a number of books actually, including China's Rise, Strength and Fragility. And we'd be very keen to hear from Comrade Au about the political economy of China and various questions to do with that. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you to having me just share my observation with you. And first of all, yes, this presentation will be in two parts. So the first part is a general ideas of what I think about China, and just as a follow up with Adrian's presentation, that is, I was in Philippines and have joined a conference in the University of Philippines about China, and the law professors spoke of a joke that some of these so-called islands in the South China Sea within the so-called 9 dashed lines, well, actually it's not islands, it is just rocks. So he said that there is a joke about this, is that if the Philippines government just blew up all these rocks, then there will be no dispute anymore. So you can imagine that, yeah, actually there is a lot of stupidity and or dispute over the South China Sea. But yeah, okay. I started with actually several questions. Firstly, is China a capitalist country, or is it socialist, or it is still a transitional between the two? Well, my answer to this question is that China has been a capitalist country long before 2023. It had turned to capitalism since 1980s, and the turning point, the qualitative change, we can spot 1 year, but it is not from a economic criteria. It is from a political criteria. I think, yes, the 1989 crackdown on the democratic movement, the June 4th massacre, in itself is a signal that China Communist Party would turn capitalist and seek for a total integration within global capitalism. I think people would disagree with that. They always point to, well, how much capitalist elements in China in the economic terms. But I think this is a 21st century economism, not really Marxism at all. That's the second. Well, I would not have time to talk about, well, what is the character of the China state in the Mao's China. But I don't ever think that it is in any sense a genuine workers' country. No, it is nothing like that. But let me stop here on this issue. So I think China is totally capitalist. From 1990s to the 2020s, one may say there were three waves, great waves of privatization. First, among the state-owned enterprises. Secondly, the beginning of privatizations and the completion of urban land. Thirdly is the privatization of farmland, which is still going on. And also, on top of all these three waves of privatization, we have a complete commodification of everything, from land to labor power to everything. So I find it quite amusing that there is some writers, say John Rawls, still think that China is a capitalist, is a socialist state. But his book entirely focused on economic performances, how productivity is, how it alleviates poverty. But it missed the mark. We must first look at the political element, because the 1989 democratic movement, where millions of workers are joining, they joined the movement because they are against the so-called Guandao, which means, yes, they are against the bureaucrats speculating in the markets with their power. So this is the first question. The second question, then, is, even if China is a capitalist state, is it a developing country, a global south country, a country which is still progressivist, relatively progressive, precisely because it is a global south country? Well, I think China is complex and contradictory. There are aspects of underdevelopment. There are aspects of global south phenomenon, but it is also a country which is quite modernized now. Well, I'll give you just some a glimpse of how what China today. China today is the second largest economic entity in the world. It is also the second largest trading country, and in terms of manufacturing, it is the world's largest manufacturing country, and it has the top foreign reserves in the world as well. And in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of those incoming for FDI, it is always in the top rank. Top 5, and so on. But and in terms that this is very important, and in terms of outward FDI, before 2000 or even 2010, it is not very significant. Before 2000, it is insignificant at all. But nowadays, it is now the top, in the past 5 years, 6 years, it is the top 5 in terms of outward FDI. And in 2020, it is the top country in outward FDI. So if we say China is a developing country, you must balance yourself with the facts that I just talked about. So China is complicated. China is not merely a developing country or global south country. And third question is that is China an imperialist country? Well, it is a more complicated question. But so I am actually is necessarily oversimplifying things. So I just treat this as a start of debate between us. I think China, Adrian has given a very good report that there are huge asymmetry of power between the U.S. and China. But we must bear in mind that it is the criteria for a country being an imperialist country cannot rely on a comparison of the U.S. Now Britain has been depicted by the Americans officials as a I forgot the second-rate or third-rate country now. Yeah, so it's so Britain is not on a par with U.S. And not to mention about Dutch, the Netherlands. They are a tiny country, and it is still imperialist. It has a very high positions in the global value chain. Yeah, but it is far away from being equal with the U.S. So I think some of the some authors I read about denying that China is imperialism because China is very far from U.S., especially from military terms. Yes, I all recognize this. The U.S. has 800 military bases in all the world. China has only 1 or 2. Yes, there is big asymmetry, but this fact in itself cannot be a reliable criteria for deciding whether China is imperialism or not. And secondly, oh yes, I don't have much time, so because so I just shorten it further. So I would define China as an emerging imperialism because the ability is there, and what is more is the political agenda is there too. And what is more important is China as a huge, powerful, industrialized country. It carries a necessary logics of expansionism. And expanding what? Expanding is monopoly capitalism. Do not forget that in the beginning of the 20th century, when Hobson and Hillfading and Lenin begins to talk about imperialism, they all see a monopoly capitalism as something that's leading to imperialism. But if you look at China today, well, of course, there's this fusion of the state and financial capital and commercial capital, and because all the commanding heights of the economy has been in the hands of the state-owned enterprises. And state-owned enterprises, the core, the mother company, yes, of course, is state-owned, but it also, because it is floated in New York, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, it also attracts a lot of private shareholders, of course. But essentially, it is controlled by the state. So especially the banks and all the financial and insurance and communication and so on. So we have a not perfect, but very advanced monopoly capitalism. So its logic, it is an expansionist logic. So we can, okay, I don't mind we don't use imperialism, the term, I mean, that doesn't matter. We do not need to be too dogmatic about terms, but can one really deny China as an expansionist country with the same logic in capitalist exploitation? Can one really argue that? Actually, my friends organization has produced a Belt and Road report. It's a critical report, and one of them is one obvious example is when China has acquired the Greek port, Tiberias, because the government sold it to China, and then you know what they did? The new boss cracked down on the striking workers in the port by making a phone call. Actually, it is the embassy to do this too. Yes, making a phone call to the interior minister, asking them that you must send police to crack down on the workers. I wonder how socialist it is to do this kind of things. So but in the end, I will also argue that there are huge there are opinions that they attach huge importance to the issue whether China is imperialist. But okay, even if I consider China is not imperialist, but is this state in any sense progressive from the perspective of working people, from the perspectives of protecting our environment, our planet? No, it is a reactionary state. If you listen to the voices from below, you must listen to the voices from below and do not just judge China from the very dubious Western main media. We should be skeptical about them, of course. So we should be independently observing and analyzing China. But in the end, even China is not so-called imperialist country. It is a totalitarian state. It is a state which denies workers basic human rights, basic freedom of even say, sorry, say for instance, in the 2020 lockdown in China, actually China is it's not a regular lockdown. It is locked up. The regimes are locking people in their homes or in the outside the building or in the communities, forbidding them to go out at all. They lost the freedom of even going out to buy their necessary stuff every day, and people were ill and could not send to the hospital precisely because of this locked up. So China is a totalitarian state, and it allows no check from any people, from any social movement. So therefore, workers are not allowed to organize, not even not even unions, but even any organization of workers is banned. So this is a totalitarian state, with a capitalist economy and society. So no one can check the dictator. Whereas, well, we all know the limitation of liberal democracy, but comparing to the totalitarianism, the rights of the workers, we are measuring it from the perspectives of workers' right. So, and this is not because of the boss giving us this right. You know much better than me that the liberal the rights to organize among workers or any other strike action and so on, or this right to resist exploitation were won by your predecessors. But in China, even if we have won something in 70 years ago or 100 years ago, these are long gone. We have nothing political rights anymore. So the danger in China, well, now I don't think, yes, I think in technical terms, yes, in terms of technical terms, as a China and US war is not that imminent. And we shouldn't be bowing to these warmongerings or the exaggerations of war being imminent. No, it is not imminent. But on the other hand, we must bear in mind one thing, that it is also true that because there is absolutely no freedom of press, absolutely no social movement allowed. So we have a regime that they can declare war and make war just by pressing a single button, and we will have war. Just like in 1979, suddenly Deng Xiaoping decided to go into war with Vietnam, and we now know quite well that China wants to appease American, so they give them a good present by attacking the enemy of the US empire. The Vietnam War is absolutely nonsense, no reason at all. But Deng Xiaoping just press the button, then we have war, and tens of thousands were killed and wounded, and so on and so forth. It is the same today, that there is no force in the society, in the political arena, not to mention that we can stop the dictators to go into war. So there's also great uncertainties. And if we talk about the asymmetry between US and China, we must also talk about one thing, that yes, in China, Xi Jinping can make a war entirely freely. That is the difference. Okay, I think I've spent already enough time on the issue, and I would like to talk to Taiwan later. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, comrade. I'm going to invite now comrades to ask questions, put their hand up. And while we're waiting for comrades to formulate their questions, I would like to speak to Adrian and Ao a little bit more, if possible, and ask you a couple of questions, if that's possible. Starting with you, Adrian. Now you've heard what Ao has said. And I think there's a lot of agreement between you and him in terms of the threat of war is not quite immediate, etc. What do you think about his characterization of China being an outright capitalist country and perhaps an emerging imperialist country? I mean, take what he said at the end, the question of free unions. There are none in China. Does that limit the ability to actually develop a fully capitalist country, fully capitalist society? And there's a lot of state ownership of companies, of course, which some people believe makes it a sort of worker state. I don't believe that, but that's what many people look at. But do you think it's a fully capitalist state? Oh, you're muted. Sorry, comrade.
I would say it is a.
Sorry, Adrian. Sorry, I've just asked Adrian because you've answered that question already. I'll ask you another question.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's very important to see that all capitalist societies have their own social and historical soil on which they've grown, which has sedimented in institutions the outcomes of previous disputes and struggles. It reflects their position in the world system. So you get, clearly, Germany's not the same as India, is not the same as Britain and America, and so on and so forth. With that proviso in mind, we shouldn't be looking for a pure model, the market determining. For a long time in the post-Second World War period, clearly we had state-owned industry in Western Europe and elsewhere, state-directed capitalism, dirigisme, France, and so on and so forth. So with all that in mind, yes, I do think it's a capitalist country. I think the jury's open whether it remains state capitalist. I mean, I know ours pointed to various things. State ownership of finance, for instance, is important. It enables, it's something he's written actually, saying that profitability is a key criterion for state-owned enterprises, even if they're zombie state-owned enterprises who don't do profitability very well. They're living in a world of profitability, but they're protected by state-owned banks. So yes, I do think it's capitalist. I'll say something else about the Chinese Communist Party. You know, I've seen in the chat some reference to the bureaucratic elite as a caste, a bureaucratic caste sitting on the working class and so on. The bureaucratic caste sits on top of the capitalist class. The Chinese Communist Party is full of billionaires, millionaires and billionaires. Jack Ma recently went into re-education, disappeared for 3 months, a couple of years ago, who's the owner of Alibaba. He's been a Chinese Communist Party member since 1985. He's worth $50 billion. The training manuals of the Communist Party describe, it's all in the book, describe themselves as a party of neoliberal management for market efficiency and control of the population. They're very conscious at their level, whatever the rhetoric that comes out about, you know, we're all in it together sort of thing, the sort of David Cameron approach. It's quite clear that it's a party with deep roots. It's true. It's got nearly 100 million members. It's got deep roots. Some of them are about legitimacy. Some of them are about social control. But it seems to me quite clearly a communist party sitting on an economy which is only 30% state-owned. 60% of GDP is produced by the private sector. And we're used to fighting over public housing. In Britain, 66% of housing is privately owned. In America, 63%. In China, 90% private ownership. You know, all the data suggests it's quite clearly a capitalist economy.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's a few people with a hand up now, so I'm actually going to open the for questions from the floor. Ian, if you want to come in first and switch on your camera. Also, if you have a particular question to either of the speakers, if you could outline that, comrades. Thank you.
Good evening, comrades. And I think they were both excellent presentations. I'm absolutely fascinated by both of them. I wanted to ask a question of both of you, if you will, about the interrelationship of China and its enormous productivity to the wider capitalist economy globally. Clearly, China is now the workshop of the world. Any kind of interference with that would have a dramatic effect upon the wages of workers throughout the world. Mm. From that point of view, firstly, how do you assess the interrelationship between the Chinese economy and the world economy? And secondly, does the fact that anything that would stop cheap Chinese goods being part of the basis of Western consumerism, does that itself not militate against any kind of military intervention one way or the other? And a supplementary question, because I'm intrigued by it. China clearly makes some good stuff, you know, Apple and all the rest of it, and it's on a par with anything in the world. And it clearly also makes some stuff which isn't very good at all. And in the USSR, where almost everything was uniformly rubbish, you can only pick out a few things in the former USSR which they were able to do reasonably well because they were able to exert a very direct discipline over the workforce. But why is there this sort of strange variability in the quality of Chinese goods? Just those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Al and Adrian, either of you want to come back on this?
Well, Al's turn. I've had one go.
Yes, Al, are you still there? Have you got your camera? Can you switch your camera on? We can't see you anymore.
Oh, maybe.
Oh, you were there.
Maybe Adrian. Yes, go first. Because I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the first part of the question.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Adrian, please.
Ian's question. I don't want to be flippant and dismiss it because I'm not going to. I'm going to go through some data, but we should beware being too rational when we're talking about ruling class calculations. In other words, I mean, I can see from your response, your facial response, that Norman Angell wrote in 1910 about the impossible war between Germany and Britain because of the interpenetration of the economy. But they're in competition in third markets in Africa, in the global south, and so on. And the dynamics of the system pit them against each other. So although it's quite true to talk about the interdependence of the Chinese and the rest of the world economy, particularly at a financial level, Al mentioned about the holding of $3 trillion of overseas debt in China, the biggest creditor in the world. Clearly the supply chains feeding into our consumption. Actually, John Smith's book on imperialism in the 21st century looks at this. Super book, although he doesn't mention China. His main focus is on Bangladesh and elsewhere, showing that the exploitation of, in this case, Bangladeshi workers, but you could apply the same logic to Chinese. He uses super exploitation, but we can debate about that another time. But exploitation of underpaid workers in the global south does produce this Lidl t-shirt or H&M, and these are the issues that John's talking about. What we've seen is that the decoupling is beginning. So, for instance, a lot of lower grade production, lower quality production, less technologically developed, is moving. So Bangladesh is taking textile manufacturing, and so is to some extent Laos and Vietnam and so on, textile manufacturing from China. But as China's moved up the value chain, it's not losing out, its workers are losing out. But what is the raw material input to Bangladesh's textile manufacturing is high grade Chinese textiles. Interestingly enough, using cotton produced by Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, which is the dominant cotton producing area. So there's an overlap with oppressions and so on. So there's definitely decoupling. It would have a dramatic effect on our living standards in the global south, in the West, as well as elsewhere. Not so much in the global south. A lot of production from China, for instance, has decimated the African textile industry. The African ruling classes have signed up with the Chinese ruling class. China moves in, Nigeria loses 100,000 textile jobs, and so on. Yeah, we would suffer as consumers, but not so much as producers. So I disagree a little bit about the good stuff. I'm no doubt China produces all sorts of tat like everywhere else does, but it's moved quite rapidly up the value chain, and it's now competing with America to produce supercomputers and all that sort of stuff. I'm not sure I agree with you that the Soviets' production was all rubbish. I've got a Soviet radio, for instance, and I'm interested in valve amplifiers, and I always use ex-Soviet and Russian valves for what it's worth. Of course, this is not cutting edge stuff, but there was good stuff produced, mainly, unfortunately, because of the pressure from the West of a military nature. China's escaped that by being close to America for 20 or 30 years since it joined the World Trade Organization. My suspicion is it now has to produce more military grade stuff and direct production away from that. I hope I've answered your question. There was one in the chat as well. You know, we shouldn't be too rational. The Americans would knock out their nearest competitor if they thought they could get away with it, to buy another 50 years lease of life of American leadership.
Indeed. Thank you. Al, do you want to add anything, or shall we ask the next question?
Simply put, is China is huge, and China is lots of contradiction. It has the very advanced factories and plants and innovation going on, but it has also a lot of third-rate, fourth-rate producer. China is huge, contradictory.
To both speakers, then a question briefly, which is sort of in our title. You know, do you see the conflict of Russia-Ukraine at the moment that is propped up by the West as a war of deterrent against China? I mean, you both said you don't think there's an imminent threat of war, but you know, is there a real chance that China could take on the US, which is a capitalism in decline, which is going through big economic troubles? Is that what's behind it, or why is the sort of the drums of war? You know, even you both say it's not very realistic, but what is really behind that? That China, you know, seems to be in the crosshairs of imperialism.
Guide us, Tina. This time.
You go first, Adrian. Go on.
Well, in terms of your question, clearly it didn't start. You know, I don't think the Americans goaded deliberately the Putin offensive, although it caused it by the NATO expansion. But I don't think they wanted that response to the NATO expansion to take place. But they have subsequently used it opportunistically to create this deterrent argument over Taiwan, and of course over Ukraine itself, to reinforce their alliance structures, to reinforce their position as number one in military terms, and to head off, because it's still going through this long-term relative economic decline. I think the left got it a bit wrong. When Paul Kennedy produced his book in 1987, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, the far left sort of leapt upon this and said, thank God, it's inevitable. The military superpower in the world will decline. Well, it's 40 years later, 45 years, whatever it is, long time later, in which clearly it's still gone through a slow decline since then, but it is bloody slow. And if anybody's threatened by Chinese economic might, it's more the EU. I've got the figures. The EU's share of world trade has gone down much more dramatically than America's has in the last 30 years. The EU has got virtually no IT industry to speak of. It will be squeezed by America and China. So yes, I think there is, from its own point of view, a deterrent effect. I also think the deterrent effect operates in the global south. Because capitalism is competitive rather than rational, it's very tough for the world number one to watch another country treading on its toes. So I don't think China's producing arms for Africa on the scale of America, but it does sell to 53 out of 54 African countries arms. Small stuff, police art, you know, pistols for cops, but also the odd submarine and this sort of stuff. And that is a long-term threat to America if China can do that. In Latin America, it's got that observatory in Patagonia, in Argentina, it's got deals. Argentina is now apparently its currency on the streets. You can buy in renminbi. You don't have to use the peso. You know, it's one example. But it's a trend. There is a trend to China asserting itself and spreading its influence in the global south. My own view, by the way, is the Belt and Road Initiative is going to go pear-shaped very quickly, and there's evidence of this, that countries are being brought back into the American fold and are turning against China to some degree over loans and infrastructure projects and white elephant. The recording stopped. Is that important? I don't know. So that's why I think America's heading off China, because it's become too powerful and unpredictable. The world isn't predictable. America's trying to make it more predictable, but in its own interests. And as for our spending power being diminished by the decline of Chinese exports, hard luck on the Western workers. What's happening?
Right. Hello. I think. Hi, Adrian. I think Tina's had a bit of problems with her internet, so I will just spotlight myself as well. I'm really sorry about this. She was having problems before with her internet, which is why we came in as co-hosts. So I just introduced myself. I'm not exactly dressed for this. I've been in the garden, but anyway, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. So I think Pat Byrne has a question, and I'm going to bring him in now. I'm going to spotlight Pat. Can you put your video on, Pat, please, so that I can add spotlight to you. Pat? I can't hear me. Pat? No.
Yeah,
Pat, can you put your video on,
yeah,
please?
unfortunately, a message comes up that says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, okay. That's really strange. Let me see if I can ask you to if I can ask you to no, I don't seem to be able to ask to start video. There we go. So I've asked you to start video. Can you do it now?
All right.
There we go. Excellent. Right. So I'll just add spotlight. And there you go. Please ask your questions of our guests, of our guest speakers.
Okay. Well, the first, obviously, this is a massive question about the nature of China, isn't it? Which we can't hope to solve today. But one question I'd like to ask of Adrian, because he made a very good point about how there's no one model of capitalism, that there's many different varieties of capitalism. So the logical question to ask from that is that why do we then presume that there is only one model of socialism, and that every version of I'm using socialism in a very broad term because obviously even the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc, some people argue we're not socialist in the sense that the workers were obviously not, the ordinary people were not in charge of the system politically, but I think that most people regard it as a socialist economic system because most of the economy was owned by the state. But wouldn't it be possible for there also to be other versions of socialism, using it in that broad term? Now, the question that related then to the percentage of the economy that is owned by the public sector in China, I think Adrian's figures are questionable. If you include, first of all, okay, you have privately owned houses, but the land is owned by the state. If you include the state-owned enterprises, the public services, the local government and central government revenues, you actually get a much higher percentage of, and I would argue it's as much as 70% of the economy. The 30% of the economy that is the private sector obviously is very productive and has a major role in, very dominant role in terms of employment and so on. So I think there is a lot of debate about that. And one of the complications is that the state-owned enterprises own a lot of companies. Yes. It's a very strange setup. And nobody can actually get to the bottom of all this because it's very complicated. So, so the other question I'd like to ask is that you said that that America has not really gone down that much in terms of trading compared to China. Well, I don't understand that because China is now the largest trading country with 149 countries on the planet. And if you see how 20 years ago, America was the dominant trading partner with those countries, and that switched over to China. So I don't quite understand that. The other question that relates to this is the GDP figures. that a lot of American GDP figures are distorted because it includes debt, it includes financialization of the economy. I think if we look at a realistic sense, China is now by far the biggest economy in the world. It manufactures more than America, Germany, and Japan put together. So I think that China is a fundamental challenge to America, and that underlies why we're having this semi-Cold War or Cold War, whatever you want to call it. The last point, if I'm allowed, I don't want to too long, sorry, is I don't understand, this is just to Al, I think. I find it, and I'm sure a lot of us find it strange, that you can have China as being a capitalist country, and yet it's run by a Communist Party, it's got a constitution dedicated to the proletariat, it's all sorts of features, discussion about the ideology of the state, Marxist-Leninism. China has lifted 850 million people out of poverty, which no capitalist country has ever done. And even to the point where they've got rid of all poverty, extreme poverty, which you remember in the Western, in the capitalist system, they always say the poor is going to be with us always. And last but not least, China is leading an anti-imperialist struggle, against the neo-imperialists around the world, and building up institutions to achieve that based on the equality of nations and non-interference, sovereignty, and so on. Why would, and they're spending so much money on this, why would they do that? If they were capitalists, why do they do these things which are actually against capitalism? I don't quite understand.
Thank you, Pat. I think I'm going to ask Al first to come back on that. It does beg the question, what is socialism, of course? I mean, there's a difference between state ownership, I'd say, and, the working class running things. But I'll leave it to Al to reply here.
Yes, firstly, I would like to respond to the thesis that there could be also varieties of socialism. Well, I fully agree with that. There will be great varieties of capitalism. There are great varieties of socialism for different reasons. Because for capitalism, the economy and the state, in certain extent, is separate, although China is very, very different from European countries, but still we are talking about two arenas in the society-wide country. So, well, you can have a capitalist base, but the political structure is very different. This is an innate character of capitalism. Well, socialism, it is the freedom of the working people, which means definitely that there would be quite different versions of socialism. But the problem is when we talk about that, we are talking about on the level that is very, very general, that we may forget that there are still basic criteria to the question of what is capitalism and what is socialism. Socialism, first of all, means the freeing of the society from a state machinery. But what we have been seeing is 70 years of Communist Party rule. It has been perfecting its state repression. And if you talk about proletariat, I find it, honestly, yes, a bit offending. Just when did you ever see the proletariat cast their vote? Of course, well, it could be a socialist democracy that is different in the voting system. Say, for instance, if there are still people, a lot of people, including me, that think that the October Revolution is a workers' revolution, and they didn't have a liberal democracy of a regular of that kind of election, but they did vote. They cast their vote in the factories assembly. This only stopped after 1921 or 22. gradually stop, gradually stop. When did you ever see a news report, even from, say, for instance, Al Jazeera, it's not Western media, okay? Have you ever seen reports that the population, the citizens, ever vote? Where is the vote? You don't even see that. And how about workers' the right to organizations? I mean, self-organization. When what is the right to strike? And what is the right of freedom of speech? And why there is even now the state crackdown on the Maoist students who organized the workers to set up try to set up a workplace unions in the Jessic plant, 2018. That doesn't make sense. So I think, yeah, it's just interesting to look back. You know, it's now it's 20 years ago or 15 years ago, we had debates with a lot of Maoists that they think that they thought that yes, China is going on the wrong way. Yes, but China is still socialist because the Communist Party is still there. But after they said these kind of things, very soon some of them get arrested, and eventually most of them get arrested. I mean, the most active one, and then it forced some sections of the Maoists to begin to come to an agreement with us that China is capitalist. I think it is quite amusing to read their argument and so on. So I think the idea that China is some kind of socialist or friendly to is the friends of proletariat, I think honestly it's just a bit offending. Especially when hundreds of thousands of just common people, just workers, has to flee Hong Kong or being arrested and imprisoned. So but finally, I think there is also what a final intervention about the criteria for socialism, which is very important. State ownership never, I will repeat, never any important criteria for deciding whether a country is socialism. No, Engels has said that very explicitly. And if I think I learned from the British left a lot. Honestly, yes, I learned a lot, but including this this so-called ideas of socialism. So I think I don't need to send the link to any comrades here about Engels' quotation.
Thank you, Al. Adrian, do you want to say anything about this, or perhaps the idea that, you know, the China's biggest economy in the world that Pat mentioned as well?
Well, yeah, I'll deal with that then. I don't need to say anything more than Al has said about, you know, it's quite clear I disagree with Pat, but I do think it's a good question. And it does, the reason I like the question is I'm not as offended as Al by it, is because it makes you think. It's not a side swipe or just based on labels. You have to think these things through. But I would just say, why do we feel the need to identify it as socialist? Is there a psychological drive to this? I'm not talking about Pat or anybody's psychology, but I do think we tend to take sides, and sometimes we have to say, don't take sides geographically with them or them. We need to take the side of the working class internationally. That's one point. Second point is just a little joke about the joke that Deng Xiaoping had two sets of advisors in the transition. One was led by Jeffrey Sachs, who imposed shock therapy on the Soviet Union, the neoliberal Harvard type advisors. His other set of advisors were philosophers and Marxist theories who had to find a Marxist justification for what Jeffrey Sachs and his lot were doing to the Chinese economy because of the continuity argument. We trace our roots back to Mao, and we can't be seen to be having a rupture, so we have to find justifications. On the economic side, I'll go again and look at the points that Pat made about the percent of GDP. It's true in terms of ownership of entities. The state owns more entities, but they're unproductive compared to Foxconn and so on. So therefore, as a percentage of GDP, I think Pat actually said this himself, the percentage of GDP produced by the private sector is bigger than that produced by the state-owned enterprises. As for share of global production, the figures are quite clear. That it's true. I didn't say trade, by the way, Pat. I said production. So it's true China's a bigger trader. But in terms of global production, America's had a fairly gentle decline. Europe has had a bigger decline. That was the only point I was making. That the bigger threat, which is why the EU, particularly Germany, has been less likely, under Merkel in particular, to line up behind America. They've been a bit resistant to line up behind America because so much of German capital has been sunk into China now. And they clearly have got interest in restoring German capitalism by linking to the China as a production base. Al mentioned the NGOs, Marxist study groups and so on that absolutely been smashed. 850 million, you said, taken out of extreme poverty. The National Bureau of Statistics in China contests that figure with its own figures. It suggests it's half that, about 400 million. And two Chinese scholars have gone through all the data and come up with a figure. If you just shift the year slightly from 1980 to 2020, the claim is, well, on World Bank figures, 800 million have been removed from extreme poverty. On the Chinese state figures, it's 400. If you move the starting date to 1985, in other words, discount those because of the breakup of the collective farms, peasants who were able to produce their own output and market it and so on, and the reduction in poverty started in 1978, 1980. If you remove those first years, only 150 million have been removed out of extreme poverty. But I would say this, what is the extreme poverty line? And the World Bank baseline is $1.90 a day. So it's not much of a claim, really, in terms of global progress, to remove a lot of people just above $1.90 a day. I'm not making a put down. It's saying we should lift our sights a bit higher.
Thank you both. We have two more contributions from the floor, but I think it's worthwhile looking at keeping this in mind. What Adrian just talked about, the idea that there are big capitalist companies that have invested a lot of money in China, and they're not as keen on this whole idea of taking China down as perhaps the American government would be. That it is always interesting when there's a division of like that within capital. It's not one hegemonious block. There are differences within capital, and that comes to the fore now. So we've got two more speakers that I would like to briefly bring in. I think they have a similar view. Marion first, and then Anthony, and then perhaps Al and Adrian can reply to both. And summing up, because we tried to finish about 7:30, we're running a little bit late. Apologies about that, but it's been a very interesting discussion. Marion, would you like to come in? You need to unmute and start your camera, please. Otherwise, I'll start with Anthony first. Anthony or Marion, either of you there? Hi. Keep brief,
Well, Trotsky said in defense of Marxism, we've got to stand independent of the imperialists, the middle class, and the Stalinists. They started building the economy from the poise to the 70s. American imperialism made inroads with privatization and the investment in industry after the Soviet Union declined in the 50s. But then that led to the rebellion in Tiananmen Square. and the Russians nearly got overthrown. So the wing that wanted the plan to come, they crushed the political revolution, but the wing that wanted to actually to get more resources, more resources in different industries would do it. And we shouldn't echo the capitalist arguments that the state sector is unproductive. I mean, Tracy explained this quite well in the Revolutionary Trade. State ownership, that's just a concession to the working class, depends on a reactionary system. State ownership of a planned economy takes the whole society forward. After the 2008 financial collapse, I went into Africa, Asia, and collected all the continents, undermining the IMF. They're working with the Russian bureaucracy to undermine the IMF. But what the Chinese government post-92 reflects, after the move away from the market, is the permanent revolution. The Stalinists fought against that for 20 years, but they've had to carry, it's ironic dialectic, they actually had to carry it out in a distorted way.
Anthony, I think you're stuck now.
Oh.
Yeah, I think. Marion, do you want to come in? Anthony's.
Yeah, I think it's really important that on the one extreme you've got the John Ross that sees China as a socialist society. Then we have the two speakers here tonight that are at the other extreme. None of them are looking at the situation where and look at societies that are in transition. Now, for me, it's too simplistic to say that they're capitalists, both Russia and China, because I don't take that position. And the question I posed in the chat was, if Russia and China were just other capitalist societies, why are both Russia and China being totally demonized by the West? And now you have a hot war in Europe, in Ukraine, which has been totally triggered by the increase in the NATO and the encirclement of Russia. And the same processes are operating around China. And if they were just another capitalist society, why haven't they invited them into NATO? Why? You know, it's too simplistic to just say they're capitalists. Yes, they're the introduction of both Russia and China into the world economy had devastating effects on the Russian economy at times. But you have to also look at the situation that I don't accept that every aspect of the planned economy in Russia and China has been overthrown, that capitalism has been restored. I still see it as a transitional society. And for me, democracy is key. Yes, I mean, I've got a proud tradition of standing up for democracy. I was in Social Action at the time, taking on Redmond O'Neill and John Ross when they were going over to what I called them the tank. They were going over to what I call the tankies. And they were for the crushing of democratic processes in both Russia and China. And me and my late partner, we were instigators in arguing against that. So yes, the fight for democracy is key, but you also have to recognise and not be too simplistic in your analysis of what the society is, because it's crystal clear to me that with NATO at the moment, they've been talking about they can't produce enough weapons to take on the Russians in Ukraine at the moment. They're trying to increase the production of weapons and throwing a lot of money into it. At the same time, they're also, America's agreed to the cluster bombs going into Ukraine, which is very, very dangerous. But what we have to fight for is, how do we bring about a well-planned economy where there is true democracy, where the working class in all forms, in every aspect of society, take control and actually develop a society fit for everybody to live in. And if you're too simplistic, we're not going to be able to do that. We need to build up alliances that actually fights for more democracy. And don't underestimate the lack of democracy and the dangers we've got, at least in this country, with the increasing move towards a strong state. A lot of our rights to demonstrate are being taken away. If you haven't got a passport or a driving license, it's very hard to vote. I mean, how many people were turned away at the last local elections? So we've got real dangers. But what we've got to find is a way that we can actually fight to develop a planned economy globally, because that is the only way that we're going to meet the needs of people. And a lot of people that are in the so-called third world don't see China and Russia in the same way that some of the people in the West see them. And I think we have to fight for real democracy, but we also have to recognise and analyse what's actually going on and in these other societies. As I say, it's too simplistic just to say, oh, capitalism, they're just another form of capitalism. That's too simplistic.
Thank you, Marian. Okay, we're going to sum up now, and oh, sorry, I've pressed the wrong button there. We're going to sorry. We're going to bring this meeting now to an end with summing up of Adrian and Au, and just in response to Marian, I think Adrian and I would probably do that as well. I mean, there have been plenty of wars, of course, between capitalist countries, World War I and II. You know, you don't have to attack just a socialist country. But perhaps in the summing up, we can discuss a little bit something has changed, hasn't it? I mean, Adrian outlined that for decades there was a period of what do you call it? Bide your time. You know, sort of a leveling it with the US, nobody's, forcing anything, particularly you're trying to raise your economic game, etc., containment strategy perhaps, but something has changed recently, surely, and something has heated up. It's perhaps not yet, the tech war is not yet into a immediate hot war, but things have changed somewhat. And if we could focus on that perhaps in the summing up, and also assessment of what the next couple of years, 5 perhaps, will bring in the relationship between how will this develop economically, politically. Questions there, but if you could just say 2 or 3 sentences each. Now you have a few minutes each to give your assessment. That would be great. Either of you?
Give us guidance, Tina.
Okay.
Oh, she's gone again. Well, you froze.
Oh, sorry. Adrian, do you want to start? Sorry, my
okay. That's fine. Thank you. Well, I'll deal with the next few years in a minute. I just want to deal with Marian and Anthony. In the book I've just finished, I make the point that there is very good research on China's state-owned sector, challenging the Western view of its long-term unproductiveness and lack of contribution to the economy. It's quite clear that while in any one year state sector might not be productive, it might not make profit, its commitment to its contribution to long-term growth of the private sector, as we found in Europe in this post-World War period, when massive corporations in Italy and what have you built motorways and railways and so on, they themselves may have run at a loss, but everybody else benefited. That means the private sector. So we shouldn't get hung up that the state sector's bad in some way. And I completely echo Anthony's comments on that. And of course, many of the big disputes in China in the 1990s were against closure of state-owned corporations in the big privatization drive. Of course, the Western left would have supported the working class there. We're not getting hung up on a totem of a shibboleth, some sort of silly idea that there's one golden key that defines a society or a state economy as socialists. It's about class relations, and those corporations were not run, and Ours pointed this out in his earlier contributions, those corporations were not run either by the working class or in the interests of the working class. They're in the interest of not a socialism, but of a national development plan, which I think is what Mao actually represented. If you think that China's a planned economy, read the comments by a Chinese writer that says because of decentralization, one of the things that Deng Xiaoping brought in was so that they didn't have another Mao dominating through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and so on, was quite significant decentralization. That policy making is very, very often indicative. Oh, try that. Some enigmatic comment from the supreme leader, the great leader, and the interpretation of that policy is done at a local level. So we end up with one country, 32 economies, as it was put, making a play on the words to do with Hong Kong. It's not planned, it's chaotic. And it's got massive over-accumulation. A crisis of overproduction is emerging, and we can argue about that in very classical Marxist terms. Over-accumulation, suppression of consumption, all held together by a strong state. And because the space for reform globally is closing off, Xi Jinping's regime is very similar in terms of repression to what's emerged elsewhere. Trumpism, Bolsonaro, Modi, in Italy, Meloni today, Putin, and so on. It's not worse or better. Nobody's saying the West is a model. It's closing down on progress as well. And in the next few years, it's going to get worse. And the reason is today's Telegraph, so I didn't read it yet, somebody sent me a link. There is an article about the emerging economic crisis in China. Now, I've written about it, but I hadn't divined until today just on what scale it is. Significant deflation. While we're battling about the cost of living crisis, there is a severe deflation emerging. We've known about it as an asset price bubble bursting, people's housing that they've saved up an awful lot for because of the privatization of housing. And I will look at the numbers again. I think it was Pat who mentioned that one about the housing ownership. There is an emerging deep economic crisis. It combines two things: the stagnation of underproductive or unproductive infrastructure, 50% in some years, but on average 45%. Of total output is dedicated to accumulation, not to people's living standards. Ultimately, that produces stagnation in the planned economy, in the nationalized economy, and in the private economy, a crisis of overproduction, a crisis of profitability. That seems to be emerging on a pretty big scale, and there'll be even less space for workers to make gains. The problem is, as Ours pointed out, the repression. We need the labor movement in China to make connections, to organize itself nationally. We need independent trade unions, independent voice. We have to do what we can, and there isn't very much you can do from the outside. Al might have something different to say about what you can do from Hong Kong, where he was based for a long time, but that the future doesn't look particularly marvelous for China's state capitalist economy.
Thank you very much indeed, Adrian. I'm going to bring Al in now to give his conclusions.
I will be very brief, given the time now. I just want to say that, I'm aware, since I arrived here, actually, so because through all these kind of exchanges, I do aware that, there is a lot of local comrades here hate this British capitalism, hate this liberal democracy for being so so repressive from time to time and so on. I'm from Hong Kong. I have been subjected to colonial rule for most of my life. I knew that too. But I just wonder, what is it to do with the question of whether China is socialist or capitalist? And what is it to do with the question that what is our positions on China? Why we judge it? Why we have to judge China from the fact that British capitalism is hell for many people? Why we are mixing these things together? Are we really, yes, too much doses of localism here in the debate about China as a global power? So I think I just hope comrades, yes, yes, sort things out properly, so that these things are not mixed together. These all kinds of emotion does not mix together, and objectively and scientifically talk about, yes, debate about China. We can have these differences of opinions. That's not a problem. But unfortunately, for those who argue against me in the chat or in the speech, no one ever prove what I said is wrong in factual terms. No one. And I find it odd that it is not a real debate. It's a parallel a parallel speeches. It is speeches that does not have crossing at any point. So it is not a good enough exchange. I hope next time we can do better. But of course, I will blame myself first too. Yeah, because it is our failure that we do not work hard enough to bring the news from China. But we do have a handicap, because China has no freedom of speech, and all media are party media. And now they destroyed Hong Kong, so we don't even have access to this freedom as well in Hong Kong. So, yeah, it will be a long way that we continued our effort. But yes, we should work from our side. We should work hard more, and I hope we can talk to you more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Al. Yes, very, 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 very passionate speech. And thank you very much indeed. Thank you to both our speakers. Thank you to the people who've asked questions. Thank you for the quite lively debate that's gone on in the chat as well. So thank you very much to everyone for being here tonight. And good night.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really good. I enjoyed it a great deal.